Those who were unable to escape succumbed to either the flames or the temperature, and in only 3 minutes since the initial spark, the tent had completely burned to the ground, leaving behind a mass of charred clothing and furniture burned down to the metal frames. There was no time for emergency services to react, and in those 3 minutes, the fire had claimed the lives of 41 innocent women and children. Although many of the guests had managed to escape, a further 90 people had been injured, either through being burned or the panic. As emergency services began combing through the remains of the disaster, they found that many of the victims had been burned beyond recognition, and as a result, they had to seek a specialist team for identification. They used dental and medical records in order to identify the victims, and over the following days, several of those who were critically injured from the attack would also succumb to their burns. In the end, the total number of dead rose to 57, coupling this with an additional 74 injuries. This crime had become one of the worst tragedies in Kuwaiti history.
The scale of this tragedy, which officials say is the worst such incident in 4 decades, has brought both grief and recrimination. The immediate focus, though, is on trying to save the lives of the many critically injured victims now in hospital.
Both the new bride and the groom came out of this disaster unscathed, as at the time, neither of them was actually in the tent when the fire occurred. Authorities immediately began to work on investigating what had caused the fire. They initially suspected that faulty electrics were to blame, or perhaps the coals used for burning incense. However, as they dug deeper, it became evident that this was, in fact, no accident. The fire had been deliberately lit in an act of arson. This was actually a shock to both families. Both Zayed and his new wife were well liked within the communities, and as far as they knew, neither of them had any enemies. As for Nasra, she had kept relatively quiet about her frustrations, so she was not an obvious suspect. But due to her close relationship with Zayed, she was automatically selected for questioning. It wasn't hard to find her either, as she was at home looking after her children, and soon after being taken into custody, came a harrowing confession. Before even considering a lawyer, Nasra broke down and confessed to setting the tent ablaze with petrol-soaked rags. But soon after being advised to lawyer up, Nasra's tone changed immediately. She no longer took accountability for the crime and formally requested for a confession to be redacted, citing she had come under pressure in the moment. This motion was ultimately denied, and her initial confession soon became part of the overwhelming evidence during her trial. But legal proceedings for this case would take various twists and turns. While being held in prison, it was discovered that Nasra was, in fact, pregnant with Zayed's 3rd child. This complicated things greatly. Capital punishment is legal in Kuwait, and is usually the standard sentence for murder. But pregnant women cannot be sentenced to death for obvious reasons, so instead, they would be served with a life sentence even after the child is born. Whether her pregnancy was faked or if Nasra had indeed miscarried, we will never actually know. But 2 months later, when she was no longer found to be pregnant, she instead claimed that her husband had arranged for a prison guard to force her to take medication which caused her to miscarry. The claim was never followed up, and no medical examination was ever undertaken to prove the validity of Nasra's supposed pregnancy or miscarriage. This defense was brought up in Nasra's trial in March of 2010, but it didn't seem to hold up much credibility. It was ultimately dismissed, and considering her terrible atrocities, the judge didn't believe she deserved any leniency for her crimes. This seemed to be the general public's attitude too, as most of Kuwait saw her as a selfishly evil young woman. She had single-handedly murdered 57 women and children in a bit of jealousy. So in Kuwait, it's standard court practice to allow the victims' families to waive their right to retribution, therefore allowing the court to let Nasra escape the death penalty. And despite the court needing only one waiver to consider this option, not one single family of the victims did so. Nasra's defense team threw every possible excuse they could find, trying to leverage her age, gender, and even mental state in order to gain a shred of sympathy. But the evidence, the victims' families, and the court were all strongly against Nasra. And although her defense tried to reduce her sentence to life imprisonment, they were ultimately unsuccessful. Her previous confession was ultimately redacted, and according to Nasra, the real story was that she never actually intended to start the fire. Apparently, she thought that this highly flammable petrol was actually water, and she used this during the ceremony to curse her husband's new marriage. Obviously, this would not hold up in court. An eyewitness eventually came forward to confirm she had witnessed Nasra pouring the petrol around the tent and then setting it alight. Not sure what kind of water needs a lighter, but Nasra's second confession clearly needed more work. Nasra was ultimately found guilty of her actions, and with no actual pregnancy confirmed, she was sentenced to death for murdering 57 women and children, and injuring a further 74 others. The court upheld the sentencing due to the severity of her crimes, and out of respect for the victims and their families. Nasra would be the second woman in Kuwaiti history to ever receive the death penalty. As said before, women usually get lighter sentences, but clearly not in this case. Following her trial, new measures were put in place to ban the use of wedding tents if they had not been erected by certified bodies, and all safety precautions must now rigorously be followed. This tragic event scarred the people of Kuwait. Kuwait is considered to be an extremely peaceful nation with relatively low crime rates. Many couldn't believe that a woman had caused so much pain and devastation in 3 mere minutes. And although she insisted that she didn't mean to kill anybody, it is clear as day to see that Nasra's actions were premeditated with the intention to kill. These intentions would ultimately take the lives of 57 completely innocent people, all there to celebrate what should be one of the happiest occasions, the wedding of a loved one. Like I said before, although Nasra intended to kill the bride, she was unsuccessful in her mission. But tragically, the bride's mother and sister were both killed in the process. 7 years later, on January the 25th, 2017, Nasra's sentence was finally carried out. She was one of 7 people to be executed that day, 3 of whom were women. Nasra was later executed by private hanging by the prison guards, supposedly giving the families of her victims some sense of justice for their loved ones. And alongside her death, so concludes the case which ended 57 innocent lives. 57 lives lost, all over the emotions of one.